Welcome to the Linux Spotlight. This show is dedicated to showing off the best thing about Linux, our community. This community is made up of developers, distro maintainers, YouTubers, and everyday users. Each one plays a vital role in our community, and the goal is to have a discussion with each individual about their journey into Linux and beyond. So join me now as we turn the spotlight on. Hello, I'm your host, Rocco, and with me today, our special guest is Eric, the IT guy. Eric, how are you?
Hey, doing well, Rocco. How about yourself?
I am doing excellent. We have talked many times, but we had met down at Self last year, and it was absolutely fabulous to hang out with you, and I am really looking forward to this conversation, dude.
Yeah, it's been a long time in the making. I think you've been after me for pretty much since we met itself to do this. So,
all right. So many people are going to know you for being that Eric, the IT guy. They're going to know you from giving talks at Linux conferences. They're going to know you for guest hosting on podcasts and just being an open source advocate all the way around. Those are the things that people will know you for. But what if I were to ask you, who is Eric personally?
well, I think the easiest way to answer that is I'm pretty much a father first. My partner and I have 4 kids between us, between the ages of 1 and 6. So as you can imagine, there's days where that's that is Eric is being a dad, is changing diapers and making sure that the kids are sharing their toys.
Yep.
But I'm a bit of an audiophile, a music junkie. I used to be a gamer, and then I became a dad. It's funny how one kind of gives way to the other.
They don't usually coincide together.
No, I'm just waiting for my son to be old enough to play Minecraft with me. I'm looking forward to that day. But I mean, music and video games. I'm a huge Marvel junkie. I've watched all of the movies. In fact, during the lockdown over the past few months, Cynthia and I, my partner and I, watched all of the Marvel movies, not in order of release, but in order that they take place in the timeline. So a little bit of nerd credit there, right?
Right. Might have been more nerd credit if it was like Star Wars or Star Trek, but Avengers is good. Marvel's good.
But yeah, Star Trek is one of the reasons why I got into technology. I was growing up, I was always that nerd. I love Star Trek and Star Wars. I had very, very adamant reasons why Star Wars was terrible and why Star Trek was the way to go. But as I've matured, I've learned to accept different points of view. So I love Star Trek, Star Wars. Actually, the last year or so, I've been getting more and more into fantasy. So I guess on my list of nerd achievements, I actually started playing Dungeons and Dragons last year.
No, you didn't.
And I did, and it. Okay, so get this. A huge tangent, I know, but. So I get into Dungeons and Dragons last year. I had a couple of friends who were like, hey, you've got to try this. It's a lot of fun. And I fell in love with the idea of tabletop gaming last year because it was so anti-tech. There was no technology involved. It was all imagination. It was role-playing with your friends. And then the quarantine happened.
Yep.
And so I had one of my groups go online. And they're like, this is so cool. We can build our maps on a web page, and we can do video conferencing. And I'm just like, no. I got into this because I didn't have to use a web browser. I didn't have to fight with Zoom.
Yep.
No, I can't do it. I can't D&D and tech. No, I can't.
Yep. No, I agree. I think we're all kind of getting worn out with the whole video conferencing thing. Because it's just it's a big part of our lives now. It's just become at the forefront. So
when people ask me what I do for a day job, I tell them that they need to think back to the Brady Bunch television introduction. So during the intro, they are introducing all the characters in that 3x3 grid, and all the faces just pop in. I tell people that is what my life looks like at work. Is Zoom call after Zoom call. For my day job, it's blue jeans. And so I live in one of those little boxes. That's what it feels like.
Yep. Well, speaking of day jobs, you have worked in the technology field for a long time. You've had, I'll just let you go through some of your history in your work experience.
Sure. I've been in IT my entire career. So as soon as I got out of college, I immediately started working in the tech field, and I worked my way up from help desk to desktop administrator, which is just a fancy way of saying that you go in and you clean out all the dust bunnies from the VP's computers, to printer repair specialist, which is usually just banging on the printer until it works. So I got my start there, and then I moved into systems administration. And then there was a point in my career, probably about 3 or 4 years in, where I rolled the dice. I took a gamble and said, okay, I've got these Windows servers over here, and I kind of know what to expect with those. But on the other hand, there's these weird things over here, these Linux servers that no one else wants to touch. But it's really cool because it's like I can be in the Matrix. I can learn all these commands, and everyone will think that I'm Neo.
Yep.
Okay, that wasn't the train of thought, but I always had this curiosity about Linux, and it's like, okay, so I'm fairly decent at Windows, I'm fairly decent at Linux. What do I do? So I rolled the dice, and I made a decision to specialize in Linux. So I went from generic desktop support to generic server support to being a dedicated Linux systems administrator, and I actually got a job not long after where that's all I did was Linux administration. I got my RHCSA, so I got a certification, so I kind of felt like I knew what I was doing, and from there, just my career just took off. I did systems administration, I did systems engineering, which means you do even more work for the same amount of pay, but you get to call yourself an engineer now. And then a couple of years ago, I took another gamble. I started to become more and more involved in the open source community, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But I started to reach out and grow in the community, and so I rolled the dice again and moved out of operations and into sales of all things. I used to swear that I'd do just about anything in technology, but I'd never go into sales, and it turns out that's kind of the start of where I needed to go. So I started working for a company called GitLab. Most people know them as one of the direct competitors to GitHub and Atlassian and so many others. So I was there for about a year as a systems administrator. And then in this past December, I actually got to start working for probably my dream company, RedHat. I've been a Red Hat systems administrator for the majority of my time as a Linux admin, and so nowadays I get to wear a Red Hat logo on my shirt. I do have the red fedora in my closet.
Nice.
So I'm doing solutions architect work at Red Hat, and specifically in the telecommunications vertical. So as you can imagine, the last couple of months things have been crazy busy,
Yep.
but it's really given me a chance to do what I love, and that's get people into a room, don't let them leave, and listen to myself talk.
That's perfect.
A lot of people ask me what it's like to be a solutions architect, and it's basically sales engineering, but the way I look at it, it's a combination of being a systems administrator and being like a guest lecturer at a college or something. I get to so most of us get into technology because we love to tinker, we love to play with things, and I know that was definitely true for me. But as a systems administrator, it seems like you spend more of your time putting out the same fires over and over again and sitting in the endless project management meetings. I swear my life as an admin was part project manager. But as a solutions architect, as someone who works in sales engineering, I actually get to play with the technology, usually before anybody else gets to see it. And then when it gets released, I get to go and talk to our customers. I get to talk to them about, what are your issues? What are those fires that you put out day after day after day? And it's like, oh, yeah, I had that same problem. And you know what I wish I had when I was in your shoes? This product over here.
Well, I think that's a perfect job for you because you not only get to play with tech, but you also get to share your excitement over that tech with people. That seems to be a perfect match.
It really is. It used to be that I would just go home and tell my family, and then I'd get this glazed over look of, I have no idea what you just said.
Yep.
What's Linux again? And here I am talking about the benefits of Yum versus DNF, and they're like, what do you do? And what I realized is if I channeled that, instead of subjugating my family to this, and instead, go on a podcast and talk about it, or go do a webinar for some company, people were much more receptive. I didn't have to start with, well, I'm a Linux systems administrator. This is a server.
Yep.
And so I could share that energy with people, and then I realized, oh, I can get paid for this. This is even better.
Very nice.
My family's very appreciative because I just tell them I do sales engineering. They're like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. See ya. Okay, cool. All right. What about hobbies, dude? You mentioned some of the things earlier, but do you have any specific hobbies that you like to do outside of Linux?
One thing that I used to do was concert lighting design. That was a fun few years. I used to do houses of worship, or country music was kind of my thing, or I had a couple of classic rock bands, some cover bands, and I had a lighting console, some metal trussing, and some lighting gear, and a hazer. Most people refer to as a fogger, but I used to go out and would spend a few hours setting up, and then I was able to actually run a light show based on the music. And while I don't get to do that much anymore, having kids kind of takes away that budget. Lighting is extremely expensive to get into, and it's really hard to compete when you're a small one-man startup versus some of these companies that have unions behind them and have literally hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cabling and trussing and generators and that kind of thing. But what it showed me was I started my own business, and I realized that more than doing the work, more than being the lighting designer, I loved the networking. I loved connecting with people. It's a lot easier to solve people's problems when they're trying to increase the entertainment value of their show. That's a much easier problem to solve than, do I use AWS or do I continue to self-host, or where do I run my production servers? That's a much more complicated problem to solve. But by being able to by learning those problem solving and those networking techniques, it really actually helped fuel this transition from operations into sales, almost a product marketing position nowadays. So most people don't know that I used to do concert lighting design. Bit of a gamer, tabletop and PC, music, and then one hobby I'm trying to get more involved in is sleeping.
That's a elusive hobby there. Well, you had mentioned earlier about the whole eyes glazing over and talking to family. And I always ask people, that's like a standard question on like Spotlight, what happens when you go home and do your family and friends? But was that a universal thing with your family and friends?
Family, definitely. Most of my family avoids tech as much as they can, and there's days where I definitely don't blame them. But friends, it varied. Being from a small town, a small school, I had a pretty niche group of friends, and most of us were very similar: introverted, nerds, and usually sci-fi geeks. So a number of us got involved in technology. In fact, one of my closest friends growing up, he and I were into science fiction. We played just about every video game under the sun on Xbox 360, and we kind of lost touch through the college years. And when we caught up to each other a few years later, he became a network administrator, and I became a systems administrator. And it's just like, oh, well, so you're still a gamer, and now you're into IT. It's like we never missed a beat.
Yep.
So it just depended. But nowadays, I'd say a lot of my friends, a lot of the people that I interact with on a daily basis are in technology. So it becomes easier to talk tech with the techies, and then I can talk. I don't know. Cynthia told me that someone was getting a divorce, one of the celebrities last night, and so I heard all about that. It's like, that must be what it feels like when I start talking about the difference between cloud native development and whatever else.
Yes, that's exactly it.
I don't care how much their prenup was.
No.
Oh, well, you probably don't care about how many hours you can save using DevOps. Okay, I get it now.
Well, we're all learning, dude. We're all learning.
Right.
All right. So you have, again, a long history in technology, but that had a beginning. That had a start. So where was that start? What was the first computer that you were able to use?
So I will never forget this, just because to this day, my parents tell everyone that they knew I was meant for technology even when I was like 5 or 6 years old, because we in the family we had a Macintosh Classic, or Macintosh XO, I think was the more technical name. It was an all-in-one build. It had a floppy drive. It had a wonderful grayscale monitor. But the thing I remember about it was when we upgraded from 1 meg with an M of RAM to 2, it was like $600, and I mean, even then we were like, we have 2 megs of RAM in this computer. What more could you possibly need?
Yep.
But the thing my parents remember about that computer is, even at like 5 or 6 years old, I figured out how to change the desktop wallpaper, and no matter how many times I showed them, they couldn't figure out what I was doing. So yeah, definitely a Macintosh Classic.
All right. So obviously, I don't think you heard about Linux when you were 5 or 6. So there's a gap there. Fill us in on the progression of computers to the point where you hear about Linux for the first time.
Yeah. So I mean, my first computer was a Mac, and then my entrance into Windows was an E-machine running Windows ME.
Wow.
I think this is what set me up to be in IT. Was that thing never worked. We were constantly reloading the operating system. I mean, it was an E-machine with Windows ME. I mean, what possible combination?
Worst combination ever, dude.
So I was a dedicated Windows user over like the XP years, and kind of Mac OS kind of went through a dormant period around that time before OS X came out. So I was contented as a Windows user. So when I was a freshman in college, I was at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and one of the roommates, one of the folks on my floor said, "Oh, so you're in the computer science track. So are you doing server administration, or you doing development?" I was like, "I do computers." It's like, okay, that's great. And we were having this conversation around his desk in his dorm room, and I won't forget looking at his desktop and going, "That's a really cool skin. How did you get your system to look like that?" He goes, "Oh, it's not a skin. It's a Linux desktop." So he was running Ubuntu, and so I was like, "Well, that's really cool." I didn't really know that there was a third option. I knew about this Mac thing that was kind of and Windows, Windows XP, it works fine. It is what it is. But I didn't know there was a third option. So I installed it on my laptop, managed to break it. It was all about trying to find drivers, and it was kind of an interesting experiment. But in the end, of course, in 2005, virtualization wasn't exactly there. So it's not like I could just run this in a VM or run Windows in a VM and play with Linux underneath. I ended up going back to Windows XP because I have term papers that are due, and I've got work to get done. So that kind of sat dormant in the back of my mind for a number of years. Probably about 3 years. I was probably a senior at DeVry University, and was about to get my bachelor's and heard about this Ubuntu thing again. It's like, oh, I remember playing with that one time. And I remember installing it, or trying to install it in the cafeteria in the school, but Wi-Fi drivers wouldn't work. So I ended up getting home and grabbed a network cable, installed it. It's like, oh, this is really cool. This works really nice. Took a while to get the Wi-Fi drivers working, but there's all these forums out there where I can find other people with similar models or similar problems, and I can work my way through it. This is pretty cool. So I ran that for a good long while. Probably the better half of a year or so. Ended up back on Windows just because it just worked. But as I entered the workforce and as I started working as a systems administrator, it's like, how can I get better at Linux? I work on these Linux servers. I'm deploying. One of my first jobs was, nowadays we'd call them a release coordinator. Basically, my job was to take Java war files from the developers and wait till 10 o'clock at night until every conceivable person was done working for the day. And then deploy the war files, and if anything broke, try and fix someone else's code, at 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. It was great fun. It became a question of how can I spend more time working on Linux? Because if I'm splitting my time, if I'm splitting my focus, I'm only getting experience half the time. So it's like, well, I remember this Linux thing, this Ubuntu thing, that's really cool. And I got it working on my laptop fairly easily. It's like, okay, that's great. But I'm working on RHEL. So this Ubuntu thing's close, but it's different enough to be frustrating. So I played with Fedora and it was all right. It was probably Fedora Core or something at that particular time, but it worked okay. And it used all the same command structures as I did on the servers. And it's like, okay, yeah, this is great, but I still got a lot of work to do. So that's when I bought my first MacBook Pro. And I really, really liked it. It was a great experience. Everything worked. I used to be an Apple hater, not sure why, but then I realized that there's a lot of value in the fact that Apple owns the hardware, the firmware, the operating system, some of the basic applications. Everything is designed to work very, very well together. It makes sense from a business model perspective and from a user perspective. So I ran Mac for a number of years because it was close enough. It was based on Unix, which is, a relative of Linux. So yep. I'm almost there, but I can get my work done and I don't have to search on forums for 3 hours trying to get my Wi-Fi drivers to work. So I had this weird on and off relationship with Linux for a long time. I was a Linux server administrator by day, and by night I tried just about everything else but Linux. I tried the Hackintosh, I tried VMs, and I tried running Windows, but only for certain things. Until my MacBook Pro started to show its age. And I remember sitting down one night being kind of tired and burnt out from work, and I was exhausted. I didn't like what I was doing. I didn't feel like I was making any difference. Because in reality, technology is moving faster and faster all the time. And you spend all of your effort just trying to keep these servers up for another day. You're just trying to keep your business working for another day. And it's like, in a year, this is going to be completely different and no one's going to care. Why am I wasting my time? Why am I working like this? It takes me 3 days to rebuild a server by hand. Yet we have scripting, we have VM templates, we've got all these things. Why am I working like this? So I will not forget going home and pulling up my browser and searching, how do I become a better systems administrator? And I stumbled across this unbelievable thing. There's this community out there. There's all these forums. There's podcasts. There's community built around podcasts. There's this thing called Telegram. I mean, within a couple of days, I'd subscribed to like half a dozen podcasts. I was like, okay, so that whole open source thing is really a thing. It's not a license. There's like people that do this stuff. It doesn't just show up.
Yep. It's the people behind it that makes it great.
Right. But that's not how I got my start. That was a wonderful after effect. So then it became, there's these podcasts that were doing distro challenges and everything. It was like, oh, well, let me try this. So I kind of flirted with Ubuntu, and I took Fedora out on a date or two. And then I've got this MacBook Pro. And one of the podcasts I was listening to at the time tried a distro challenge. Every now and then, they would take all of their systems and build it onto a different platform. And they tried this thing called Arch. And that was kind of the start of my Linux, my switch to Linux. Was this Arch distro challenge. And Ubuntu didn't work all that great. Fedora didn't work all that great on the MacBook. But for some reason, Arch and this model of MacBook worked really, really well together. So I tried I tried a project I think since been deprecated, but it's called Energros, and it was kind of a GUI wrapped Arch installer, and so it made the process really, really easy. And everyone talks about how you to earn your beard in IT, you have to install Arch by hand. No GUI wrapper, nothing. You have to install it from start to finish by hand.
Yep.
It took me two tries, I think, to get a working install, and I still have the text document. It was like 2 pages long of all the commands I needed to run. You have to run this command to get HDMI supports, and you've got to run this command to enable all the right repos, and then you've got to have an AUR helper, and just spent days working on this thing. And then a few days later, I realized I've got this working Linux thing on my MacBook, which getting anything other than Mac to run on a MacBook was pretty impressive to begin with. But to have a usable machine was even better. So I started. I was sharing my experiences and asking questions in all these Telegram groups, and it was really an interesting experience. And so it's like, okay, so I've got this Linux thing now on my laptop. And around the same time, I bought a desktop and set it up as a server. And so my first big do-it-yourself server project at home was a Minecraft server. It's like, how can I bring work home? What can I do on a server at home that I would use? So a couple of friends of mine and I, we were getting into Minecraft. It's like, oh yeah, we could pay for hosting somewhere. On one of these Minecraft hosting sites, or let me build it, let me host it, and that'll give me some experience with this whole Linux thing. So I started with Minecraft, then I worked on my laptop, and after that, it just became, okay, what's next? So I started moving off of all these different platforms into tools like KeePass and Nextcloud. So I started using a lot of these open source tools as a way as a conduit to get better at my job. And what I used as a work tool ended up becoming a passion of mine.
I tell you what, there's nothing like the community and the people in the community behind these projects to get you excited about Linux and all of the stuff in it. It's so infectious. So when you use Windows or you use Mac, there is no like major community there. You can find answers to questions, but there's no community behind it. And I think that is one of the greatest things that we have to be grateful for in Linux is the people. So you have tried, you mentioned you tried Fedora, you tried Ubuntu, you were on Arch. Are you a distro hopper at heart, I should say, or are you that stable guy that wants that stable distro?
So after tackling Arch, I ran that for a while, and I thought about being a distro hopper for a while. Let's try a different one every month, and then I looked at all the different options, and I was just like, no, I can't do it. So pretty much all of my corporate experience, and it's funny just how much the community aspect of what I do and the work aspect of what I do play off of each other, because I've just based on the environments that I've worked in over my 11 or so years in IT, it's all pretty much been dominated by Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So I know my way around Ubuntu. I can work with Ubuntu, and they're doing great work. But for myself, for my own projects, I pretty much just stick to RHEL. So my home network, my home servers typically run CentOS. Of course, being a Red Hat employee, I get subscriptions for RHEL. So I'm currently moving off of CentOS and onto RHEL, just so I can compare one-to-one. And I build a lot of demos and work and design workshops for my day job. So it's easier to do that on your home lab.
Yep.
So consequently, my desktop, my laptop, they all run Fedora, because it's the way that the relationship between Fedora and RHEL and then CentOS is set up is Fedora's not so much a test bed, but Fedora is the next iteration of RHEL. So like Fedora Streams and that kind of thing, or Fedora, I think it was Silverblue, ended up becoming Streams in RHEL and CentOS. So yep. I'm very much a stable guy. I'm pretty set in my ways. I run Fedora on my workstations and CentOS or RHEL on the server side.
Nice, very nice. Well, I remember when we were down at Self, we talked about podcasts. We were there among all of the podcasts that were going on live, and we talked on Telegram about these as well. So, do you have like a list? Like if I opened up your podcast app of choice, what would I find?
So if you opened up my podcast player, there'd be Critical Role at the top, which I'm on episode 12 of like 150. It's a D&D based podcast. But you'd also see shows like Arrested DevOps, which is more of a DevOps enterprise IT level podcast. But I still have a lot of my classics. I'll listen to Linux Unplugged every now and then. There's Destination Linux, and This Week in Linux is another podcast I listen to. I get a lot of my news there. So a lot of it's not so much enterprise focused. It's very, very community focused.
Right. Well, is there an area in podcasting itself that you feel is missing, or is there an open hole for a Linux podcast anywhere?
So it's funny that you should mention that, because last week I finally hit a milestone in a dream of mine. Ever since I started getting involved in the community, ever since I started talking to people over Telegram and listening to hours and hours of podcasts every week, one of the things that I stumbled upon for myself was that I liked this operations thing, but I really liked being able to influence and motivate people further. And I've got this long history in IT, and a lot of it was very frustrating, was very demoralizing. I'd suffered from burnout more than once, where my plan was to move to a tropical island and set up a bar and just never look at another piece of tech again. One of the requirements would be that there'd have to be no cell phone reception on my island, because I was just that done with the industry. And what I realized, and I have several mentors and friends in the community that have all encouraged me in this direction. And Rocco, you're definitely one of those people who said you have strong opinions, you have a lot of energy, and instead of diverting that energy into opening up a tropical bar, you could instead start a podcast. Say what you're thinking, share your experiences with people, tell your story. And so back to your question, last week we finally did that. So last week, the IT Guy brand, if you will, finally launched. And the first announcement around that was I'm partnering with the Destination Linux Network. And I'm going to be one of the hosts. I'm going to be on their content creation team. And as part of that, we're launching the Sudo Show. So the Sudo Show is co-hosted by a friend and colleague of mine, Brandon Johnson. He also works at RedHat. He and I are co-hosting a show, a bi-weekly show. So every 2 weeks, we're launching an episode based around enterprise and open source. So I'm really excited about it. And people that have known me since I got involved in the community know that I've tried to launch this podcast for like 2 years now. It's becoming a running joke for some people. Hey, how's that podcast coming? So all those jokes can finally be laid to rest because episode 1 dropped on the 25th.
Yep.
So our goal is to kind of fill a hole that we've seen in podcasting, and that's We spend a lot of time with the community, and we spend a lot of time talking to very large customers, names and logos that you'd recognize very, very easily, that all have the same problem, or the same set of problems. And so what we're hoping to do is we're hoping to kind of cross-pollinate between the enterprise world and the community. So there's people in the open source world that tinker, that are hobbyists, that like to distro hop, and they've got 16 PCs on their desk, and they all run a different distro, who want to do this for a living. They love tinkering, they love playing, they want to be able to provide themselves a living doing this kind of stuff in IT. And then on the other side of that same coin, you've got all these people who were very much like myself, who spent years in IT before even realizing that open source wasn't just a license. Open source was people. Open source was a community. I've been able to fix enterprise level problems by tapping into the resources that I've built through the community, sometimes quicker than the company who I'm paying for support.
Yep.
So how do you take people like myself who work in IT, who are missing out on the biggest piece, are missing out on the community, on the friendships, on the ability to just, instead of just saying, hey, XYZ product really sucks because they're missing this feature, instead of just posting that on a forum and getting a whole bunch of upvotes and then it goes nowhere, you can actually go out and say, hey, Mr. or Miss Developer, I've got this idea for a feature. I'm envisioning it works like this. Now, I'm not a coder, but do you think you could make that happen? There's that collaboration. There's that transparency. I mean, yeah, it's great to be a systems administrator. Yeah, I loved when I was managing Linux servers, but I missed out on so much of it. So we're wanting to kind of cross-pollinate between the two communities, and I haven't seen anyone else that's doing that. So we're launching the Sudo Show to kind of fill that gap.
Yep. So you dropped the first episode on the 25th, and podcasts are something that start out being one thing and maybe evolve into another. So what do you want the Sudo Show to become to a listener?
So I know I wouldn't be where I'm at. I wouldn't be working with the people I'm working at the companies I'm working at, without the influence of the community. There's people like Noah Chalaya. There's people like you, Rocco. There's people like the team that have now come together to form Destination Linux, that without your voice, I would not have been able to make that transition. And while I enjoy the tinkering and the technologist hobbyist type approach, not everyone's going to want to do that. But there's still so much value to be gained from being a part of the open source community, even if you're not like a tinkerer. One of the myths that I try and dispel about the open source community is you have to be a developer to participate. That's totally not true. If the open source community could get more involvement from a wider variety of backgrounds, of experience, of expertise, the community is just going to be better for it. So if we had CIOs, thought leaders, project managers, people with different points of view that could then help out with the community, with some of these projects, help promote projects and collaboration, you're just going to see better and better and better technology. And I'll give you an example. I like I mentioned, I used to work for GitLab, and one of GitLab's best contributors, because GitLab's open core, which means that about 80% or so of the application is completely open source. There's few pieces of it that aren't quite pristine yet, or that they hold back for more enterprise level, and that's how GitLab makes their money, is off of support and enterprise features. That's where that open core comes in. When I worked at GitLab, one of our best contributors, so someone that didn't get a paycheck from GitLab, one of the open source GitLab community members, was an English teacher. So of all things, they had no technology background, but that gave this person a unique opportunity to contribute back to a project, because they didn't have that technology bias that so many of us technologists have, that he could look at it from a readability standpoint. Can I read this document and understand what you're asking me to do? and does this type of language lend itself well to translation to other languages? I mean, literally one of the best open source contributors to GitLab didn't have a day worth of technology training in their lives, nor did they ever intend to, but they were constantly working on the documentation.
Well, this podcast, Sudo Show, you recently launched, but how did it start with your co-host? So how did you guys meet, and how does that all work out?
So there is a unique podcast, and it's still going strong, called Linux Unplugged. It's hosted by a group called Jupiter Broadcasting, and it's almost like a virtual LUG, like a virtual Linux users group. A whole bunch of people jump on. They have a list of topics. They present the topic, and then they open it up to a chat room, a mumble room, and you can you can collaborate. You can give your ideas. You can present some theories. It leads to some very spirited debates sometimes. And so Linux Unplugged was one of the shows that I got involved in from a listener perspective. And actually, I think, looking back, I think it was Linux Unplugged that actually did the Arch Distro Challenge that helped me switch. So you could jump in. No studio setup needed, no HD cameras or lighting or anything required. You have a decent headset and a mic, and you jump into the mumble room, and you can contribute to the show. So that was a really unique idea, and I jumped on that, and that's where I met people like Noah Chalaya. That's where I met my co-host Brandon Johnson. He's worked for RedHat for a long time, and he and I started chatting through Telegram, because we'd be on Linux Unplugged sometimes at the same time, and we'd share ideas, and we'd talk about what kind of craziness we're doing in our computer labs at the time, and he and I built this multi-year friendship. And so he and I have been friends for a number of years online. So one day he and I were talking back about my position at GitLab as a solutions architect, and not having a lot of developer experience kind of limited my ability to grow at GitLab in my position. And so he kind of talked about he works in telecommunications at RedHat. He's more of a senior solutions architect, and he goes, I have a position for you. I need you to come over here and help me with some of these projects, because it sounds like what you're doing for the podcast. So I ended up applying. I loved GitLab, and I've gone on record multiple times talking about what an amazing company and culture and technology that it is, and I still very passionately defend them when people say that GitHub's better. But Brandon had an opportunity for me that was almost written for me specifically. So in my day job, I'm not what's called an account solutions architect. So I don't have a single client or even a handful of clients that I'm taking care of, that I'm promoting, the next release, or talking through what some of the new features are. That's not the focus of my position. My job is more dependent upon content creation. So I'm hosting webinars. I'm writing slide decks. I'm taking some of the marketing content, some of the technology content, and merging them together to something that would appeal not only to the managers in the room, the financial stakeholders, but to the engineer as well. Because I've got a unique perspective on the community, on product development, and on operations, having been a systems administrator. It gives me kind of a unique perspective on this is the big picture. This is the problem that you're trying to solve. And if I were in your shoes, if I were a systems administrator, these are the tools that I would use to solve that problem. So Brandon actually brought me into a role that lends itself very, very well to launching a podcast at the same time, because it's content creation. So I just, on top of the webinars that I'm writing and planning and recording for customers, the Sudo Show is just thrown into that creation calendar as well. And then Brandon ended up becoming my team lead. So I now report to Brandon, and he's my co-host. So it's even easier to make sure that yes, work is getting done, and in fact, it's even become a thing in our meetings. We have like weekly sync calls, and it's like, okay, work is done. Now, the last 10 minutes of our meeting, we're going to talk about the podcast and how to do that. But he and I have two very different. He and I have two very different presentation styles. I'm very energetic. I'm very. I bounce off the walls. I'd follow whatever random train of thought that I have. And if you look at some of my conference talks, you'll just see where I've taken myself down a tangent, and then look at my speaker notes and go, "That's 6 minutes have nothing to do with my talk." But Brandon is much more methodical. He's much better with concrete facts. He's much better at describing workflows and how technology works from a much deeper level. So the Sudo Show's personalities come from, one, the relationship that he and I have built over the last few years just by being technologists, but also now the Sudo Show is going to benefit from that work relationship that he and I share now too. So you're going to get both sides of that personality. So I'm really excited to see how Brandon kind of levels out my crazy trains of thought.
Well, I am so happy for you, dude, because like I said, even down at South, we were talking about the podcast, and it was like you wanted to do it. I know you wanted to do it, and it's finally here, and I'm so happy for you.
Yeah, it took some time to meet all the right people, to make all the right connections, to grow a community, a personal community. But it's finally here, and everyone that teased me can now just go and subscribe to the podcast.
There you go. All right. Speaking of Self, when we were down there, we had a great time talking to everybody. You did some talks. Were you involved in any other Linux conferences?
So Self 2019 was probably my favorite experience to this point. I gave 3 talks in 3 days. That was a little much. I did 1 live demo. It blew up, and so did the backup. But the other 2 talks went really well. No live demos. But I did spend some time in the booth, and I did spend a lot of time going out to lunch with folks and staying up late swapping stories. And so that Self 2019 was an amazing experience. But I've also been to Linux Fest Northwest. I also gave a talk at Kansas Linux Fest. And was actually going to be on the planning committee for Kansas Linux Fest 2020, but between manpower and then the quarantine that kind of got pushed off to 2021.
Yeah.
So on top of all the Linux Fests that I've been to, either as a participant or as someone who's worked at booth duty or even given talks myself, I'm also pretty active in the DevOps community. And DevOps is a philosophy or a methodology around how to schedule and prioritize and actually complete technical tasks. So they have a community similar to the Linux Fest community called DevOps Days, and they're usually 1 to 2 day conferences. Most of the time, they're single track, which we can debate the pros and cons of conference scheduling another day. But I've been to like DevOps Days Des Moines, DevSecOps Days Denver, and was also involved in DevOps Days Kansas City, which is actually where I got recruited to GitLab. So I've been on both sides of the Linux Fest and the DevOps Days, and I couldn't really pick a favorite. They both have an amazing community, and it's funny as a speaker, you kind of tend to run into some of the same people at different conferences. It's like, oh, you're talking here. I didn't know I'd see you. That's so cool. I haven't seen you since the last conference we talked at.
Well, obviously none of the conferences have went on this year. Live. Self went virtual. Self 2020 went virtual. So that was actually one of the better virtual conferences that I've seen. But I think 2021 will be a good year for conferences because I think the energy will be so high for people who have missed 2020. I think it'll be great.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely plan on attending as much as work will let me. And, probably family too. That might be important.
That might be important. So we have talked about open source, and obviously you love open source stuff, but you also seem to be a little bit pragmatic on using whatever tool's the best tool for the job, or how does that work with your personality?
I think very much like my personality. I kind of, it's not an either or for me. It's more of a progression. So I've adopted an open source first approach. I'd prefer to use open source tools as much as I can, but in the end, my involvement, my energy, giving back to the community is more important than the license that's attached to it. So one of the things I'm most guilty of is I am a Todoist addict, and if you don't know what Todoist is, go check it out because it is truly amazing. It is task management mixed with task scheduling, mixed with like project management, and just the way that I can send email, I can send an email to an address and send myself a task. The way that I can schedule things, Todoist is really, really powerful. Unfortunately, it's closed source. It's subscription based to get all the pro tools, but I wouldn't be able to get nearly as much done without the power that Todoist has. Now, there's some open source alternatives that are on the rise. It's more of a cycle with me. I collect some of these tools. They may be proprietary or they may cost money every year. So every now and then, when I get an itch to try out something new, I'll start with the open source. And has this project added some of these key features that I'm missing from my current workflow, or can I adapt my current workflow to the open source alternative? And so every now and then, I'll go in and I'll kind of clean house, as it were. Moving farther away from operations and eventually sales into more of tech evangelism, product marketing. That's the trajectory that my career and my personality seem to be on. So I think getting my content out there is more important than the license behind it.
Yep.
Open source first, and getting work done is a close second.
Well, I think that's a perfect approach, is to reevaluate constantly, because I think no matter what area of your life you're in, that is a good to be retrospective and to evaluate yourself and where you are is a great thing and can only help you grow. So, yep, definitely a good thing.
Well, and that's great advice for anyone who's in a similar position. Is you're not going to be able to change your methodology overnight. It's slowly, one piece at a time. What is the next subscription that's due up for payment, or what is is there a company that's recently been breached? When I switched from LastPass to KeyPass, was when they sent out the notification that they had that big breach a few years ago. It's like, oh, well, passwords are kind of important.
Good time to switch.
Yeah. At the time, I had like 3 or 4 passwords that I'd rotate through for all of my accounts. It's like, this is a perfect time to switch to something open source, switch to something self-hosted, and switch to something that, and update all of my accounts with randomized passwords.
Yep.
So sometimes the news drives that decision. But I mean, I think that's great advice to just kind of keep yourself constantly reevaluate and figure out how you can be more efficient with the resources that you have.
Yep. Well, you had mentioned about tinkering before, and that's what kind of got you into Linux. I started using Linux just to customize it. Just that was the whole point of it. There are many reasons to switch to Linux, to use Linux, to run Linux. What drives your passion for Linux?
Nowadays, it's definitely the people, and even more specifically, I would say that my ability to share my excitement, to share my passion in general with other people is what I'm focusing the most on. I mentioned early on that a lot of my career I'd hit burnout, and I was struggling. Late in the past couple of years, I found out I was struggling against my own skill set. Trying to be one thing when I needed to be something completely different. And so being a father and having a family and not getting as much sleep at night. For all those different reasons, my time and ability to tinker and to play is so much more limited. So my hope is to share the lessons that I've learned. My mission as the IT guy is to help prevent other people from going through some of the same pains, from feeling burnout or from struggling in their career, because I don't know about many other folks, but I know when I started in the industry, you basically had one of two tracks you could follow. If you went into IT professionally, you either became a people manager, so you start out in tech, and then eventually you become a team lead. And then if 5 years into your career, you're spending all your time approving timesheets and doing performance reviews, or you become basically like an architect level type person. Those were the two tracks that were presented to me as a technologist. Was you can be a people manager, or you can be the guy who gets in way down deep and can speak binary. I mean, those were the two paths that I was basically presented. It's like, well, I'm not much of a people person, right? I'm a nerd, so therefore I should be this thing. I should be this antisocial, works in his basement kind of a personality. When in reality, there's just so much more out there. There's so much more that we can do in technology, and probably now even more true than when I graduated. But technology is just taken over every facet of our business and our personal lives, that those aren't the only two tracks. So you shouldn't have to spend hours and hours of your week trying to understand, why am I struggling with this? Why am I exhausted? Why do I hate what I do? When I got into this thing for a reason. I love to tinker. I love to play with technology and figure out ways to make my own life easier. And so I guess I'm wanting to take my decade plus years of experience and just say, look, there's a much easier way, and you can enjoy your career much more than some of the seasons I went through.
Yep. Well, let's talk about community for a second, because it's a big theme between me and you. And I think it plays a big part of Linux, but the community has not always been as receptive to new people as they are right now. Now, sometimes we still have our snafus with people, and you will see a guy be completely unfriendly to people. But for the most part, the community has gotten a lot better. But what has your experience been on a whole with the community?
So I think it depends on where you enter the community, because there are certain corners that are very, very anti-new to Linux. In fact, some of those same corners are very anti-new veteran, or are very anti-veteran even. Unfortunately, those are a very, very small minority nowadays. It's just unfortunate that such a small minority has such a loud voice in the community. And I would guess that that's fairly true of any type of community, where the most negative, the most disruptive group usually carries a lot of weight. I had the benefit of jumping in around a smaller knit community around a group of podcasts, whether it's Destination Linux and the Ask Noah Show, and Linux Unplugged. So there's a lot of cross population in those groups. So I've kind of stuck close to home, as it were. But having worked in the IT industry, and having had the benefit of working a little bit with kind of the next layer of the community, where you actually see a lot of the developers, the relationships between paid businesses that sponsor projects, having gotten to look into some of that and meet those people, what you're going to find is you're going to find a very dedicated, very motivated group of people that have come together over a common goal or a common set of goals. I mean, even on this show, I've heard developer after developer or community member after community member talk about. I looked at the catalog, as it were, of open source software, and there's this thing that was missing. I needed this thing for my life, or I know someone who's needed something, and I'm not just going to sit around and wait and hope that someone else is going to find this problem. Instead, they took it upon themselves. Some of them even took boot camps or took classes to learn how to code so that they could fix this problem. And then, because of the nature of the community, just put it out there and say, look, I wrote this thing because my great grandmother uses a Linux desktop and she can't read as well. So this is my desktop magnifier. What do you think? Can you suggest any ways to make it better, more secure, make it work faster, make it work more efficiently? And they found something that needed to be fixed. They fix it. Then they hand it over to the community and say, help me make this better. And that's predominantly the interaction that I see. It's not hostile, but it's just, it depends on where you come in. And predominantly the culture that I've seen is people have come together because they want to contribute. They want to fix something that's broken. They want to fix something that's not there, and they want to make it better. And the community provides them the eyes and the hands to do that.
Well, I think it's the best part of the whole interaction between the community and the people that are behind the scenes developing, because it is a common theme, especially on this show, where you see that, where you have this need, you have this itch that you want to scratch, and they'll go and do it. And the community responds to that. And it's just this beautiful, I don't even have a word for it. It's just this beautiful combination of things that make it great. So, yep, absolutely.
Well, and I myself owe a lot to the community, because if it weren't for being involved with joining mumble rooms or attending Linux user groups at the town library, or eventually guest hosting on podcasts, or having a community of people, friends even, that I can reach out to and ask questions of, if I didn't have that base, I would probably still be fighting and struggling my way through a career in operations instead of moving over into something that better suits my talents and my passions, whether that's product marketing or technical evangelism or podcast creation. So I myself owe a lot to this community.
Yep. I think we all do, dude. I think we all owe a lot to the community. I mean, I can make as many videos as I want, but unless the community is there to watch them, unless the community is there to share them and support them, it isn't even worth it. So I think we all owe a lot to the community. Well, what about coding and scripting, dude? Do you have a favorite project that you worked on?
So my approach to technology and projects are very much like my own personality. I'm into something one minute, and the next I'm on to something completely different. But so right now, my current technical obsession, if you will, is Ansible. I'm working. I'm a father. I'm launching a podcast and a blog, and like I said, I'm wanting to experience this thing that they call sleep. So I've found that the way to fix a lot of that is by automation. So instead of coming across one of these projects or making sure that my own personal infrastructure continues to run, or I'm writing demos and workshops for my day job, instead of spending hours trying to build up a VM, copy my SSH keys, run all the updates, it's so much easier if I can automate all of that. So it'll my current technical obsession is just going to enable me to find other obsessions down the line. So maybe this isn't the best approach, but
it's working for you though.
It is. So I've been writing playbooks that'll not only automate routine tasks like disk cleanup and patch management, but also to be my phase one goal is to be able to deploy servers, desktops, and laptops with as few hands-on tasks as possible. If I can slip an ISO on a flash drive and put that flash drive in my laptop, do the basic OS install, and then run 3 commands to kick off a series of Ansible playbooks, and then all of my productivity tools, all of my personal settings, all of my Nextcloud files. If I can get all of that automated on the workstation side, and then be able to automate my home infrastructure, whether that's a media server or my Nextcloud server or a Minecraft server, if I can keep those things deployed, and because I work in infrastructure, I'd also like to be able to switch that from like my home lab to DigitalOcean if my home internet goes out, because when things return to normal, I do tend to travel a lot for work. So if my home network goes down, I'd like to spin up new versions of my infrastructure on a tool like DigitalOcean, so I can still get to all of that. Because I am very dependent on having those tools available to me. So if I can automate that process, so much the better.
Yep. It's fantastic. But it may lead you to getting into other things. Just saying.
It will. I've already got phase 2 planned out.
All right. So there are a lot of people out there who feel that they can't contribute to Linux in a meaningful way. So one of the talks that you gave down at Self that I was able to attend was getting started with open source. And that was a fabulous talk where you go through and you explain the steps that anybody can do to get involved. You yourself have contributed to Linux with giving talks, the encouragement that you give people, the energy that you bring to the community itself. Can you give us maybe the Cliff Notes version of that talk, or just what you would say to somebody about getting involved?
So getting started with open source, particularly at Southeast Linux Fest last year, is one of my favorite talks. And in fact, that specific instance of the talk is probably one of my favorites, because a lot of the people that inspired that talk were in the audience that day, yourself included. So getting started with open source starts out talking about how to get started in IT, in a career, how to get paid for working on technology. Because that's fairly linear. It's usually, you start out with help desk and you move into systems administration, and then you kind of specialize after that, whether it's security or engineering or whatever the case may be, based on your own skill sets and your own interests. But there's a point in the talk where I just stop and say, you know what? This is not what this talk's about. This talk is about how to get started with open source. And I kind of go into a bit of my story and say that, it took me 8 years of my career before I really understood this concept. So take the next 8 minutes and just think about what you want to do with your career, because there's someone somewhere out there who needs what you have to offer. Whether that's you're an English teacher who can contribute to documentation, whether you are a systems administrator that's looking to get more experience outside of the workplace. There's all these projects that need servers out there that need to be secured, that need to be patched, that need to have working build pipelines. There is something for everyone out there, and what getting started with open source does is it's a list of resources on how to do that. These are places that I found. These are places that have been recommended to me, and kind of one of the ironies about the talk is the talk itself is open sourced. So my slides are actually on a public GitLab repository, and I haven't gotten any yet, but I have gotten feedback and added to the talk based on resources that other folks have said that, hey, when I was getting started, I came across this tool, you should add it to your talk. And I've actually changed slides based on what other people have said, help them get started.
Yep. Well, I'll tell you what, that I went to a few different talks, and that was one of the downsides to being itself. And I think it was the only downside, was that you couldn't go to all of the talks because they were going on at the same time. But right. That was one of the best talks that I attended down there. It just made you feel like you wanted to get involved. It brought that energy to the audience to say that, man, you're sitting there listening to this, man, I really would like to get involved with this. So, yep, excellent.
I appreciate that.
All right, dude. There's this meme that we have had in the Linux community for years.
I think I know what you're going to ask me.
The year of the Linux desktop.
Yep.
There's also another train of thought that we're bad at marketing. So where does all this fall in your mind? Are we bad at marketing? Should we even be marketing? Is it just a meme for the year of the Linux desktop?
So I knew you were going to ask me this question because I actually deal with this quite often. But I do think that the year of the Linux desktop has just completely been downgraded into meme status. Because if you think about it, if you think about how technology shifts, if you think about how culture shifts, there's never going to be a point, there's never going to be a day that we'll celebrate as Linux Day, where we can say we finally won the desktop wars.
How would you even measure that?
Yeah, exactly. It's not a measurable goal. Do we have to earn 51% of the desktop space before we can say we won? But if you look at it, I would suggest a different approach. Look for how is open source doing. I think desktop Linux is too tight of a scope to be measured. But if you look at open source, we have won that battle. Not only have we won that battle, but we have crushed proprietary competition. You can't really compete all that well in a closed sourced environment in an open source world. I mean, look at a lot of the cloud providers. Look at the people contributing to open source. Some names that we never ever would have thought would have been involved. Companies like Amazon are relying on open source projects very heavily. Companies like Microsoft are now some of the biggest contributors to open source projects. And depending on when you entered the community, kind of dictates how you react to that statement.
Right.
But the fact is true. Number of commits is a number of commits. So open source has won already. I just don't think, specifically to your question about Year of the Linux Desktop, I don't think that's going to be a thing. I think technology is moving at too great a speed to say that 2020 is going to be the year of the Linux desktop. Things have shifted beyond the necessity to be locked down to a desktop platform. You look at mobile computing, you look at web apps, you look at cloud development, you look at cloud-based development. I don't think the desktop is as relevant as it used to be. I don't think it's as necessary. Why would you write a Mac, iOS, Windows, and the 16 different major Linux packaging platforms when you can just write a really well-designed web app and deploy that instead? So I don't think that Year of the Linux Desktop is what we should be focused on as a community. I think we need to continue to assert our domination over the open source community, and to kind of segue into your other question. I don't know that we so much have a marketing problem. I think that there is an untapped portion of the market, and if someone out there has an idea for how to fix this problem, we need you to step up. And if you're not sure how, I've got to talk about that because because there's this group of non-technical folks who don't have a nerd in their family to be the IT support for the family. Because I've moved a lot of my family over to Telegram. I'm trying to move my family off of Windows and onto Linux. But without me, my family wouldn't know or care. The question is, do they still care? But we can argue advantages. Right, exactly. I mean, we go back to them glazing over when I tell them what I did today.
Right.
I think we just need to focus on what we're good at, and that's developing good quality open source software and building a community around it to support it.
Yep. Agreed. All right, dude, thinking back to the reasons that you chose to run Linux, have those reasons changed over the years, or are they still the same? Do they even apply today?
When I first started working on Linux, it was because it was cool. It was so different than clicking through window after window after window. I made the joke earlier about wanting to feel like I was working in the Matrix. At the time, it was something magical. It was cool. It was different. There was Linux, and then there was Windows. That was, as a systems administrator, that was kind of all there was. And so I went from the cool factor to Linux is just a better product. It's more secure, it's faster, and I still like to tell people that when Microsoft released SQL Server for Linux, all the benchmarks said that SQL Server runs better on Linux than it did on Windows, which it's run on Windows for years. So I mean, you tell me, is Linux a better product or is it not?
Yep.
So I went from the cool factor to the technology factor to nowadays. I run Linux almost because it's my gateway into a group of people that I know and I love and I depend on. I can think of 4 people right off the top of my head that I talk to at least twice a week that I've only met on the conference grounds. Like Brandon, my co-host and my team lead at work, he and I literally didn't meet until my first day working for Red Hat. Well, we didn't meet in person. We had video chats and pages and pages and pages of Telegram messages. But Linux is my gateway into a group of people that know me, that understand me, that and that I care very much about.
Yep. The community, it always keeps you on Linux. Always.
It really does. Like I couldn't never buy a MacBook again because I would be too ashamed to show up anywhere with it.
Well, look, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about Linux, regardless of what area it was, what would it be?
I would like to be able to take all the passionate conversations I see. One of the unfortunate truths about the open source community is like the DE wars, the desktop wars that people think are going on. But having been at developer conferences for desktop environments for Linux, I can tell you that those wars don't exist. I hate to tell you, but that's just not a thing. And so all the time that we spend debating, whose desktop environment is junk and whose works well, and all that time and energy we spend debating those things, I would love if I could just wave that magic wand and divert all that passion and all that energy into solving something that made a difference. Because I mean, for myself, I'm running Plasma right now, but I could just as easily run GNOME. But that doesn't matter when you look at the fact that I've got a mission. I've found a place where I can make a difference, and debating whether or not GNOME is a bad platform or whether KDE is too heavy, spending all of that time and energy debating that is not going to help fix the people out there that are struggling with burnout, that were kind of railroaded into a corner of the industry that they don't want to be in. So if I could wave my magic wand, it would be to take all that passion, all that energy that I see out there on all these different platforms, both positive and negative, and redirect it into something that's really going to improve not only our technical community, but those around us as well.
That would be awesome. Too bad we don't have that wand. One person at a time we can change. One person at a time.
Exactly.
All right, dude. Is there anything else you'd like to share with people?
So to tie into your last question, we may not have a manifestation of a physical wand we can wave and fix an aspect of our community. But I do think we can make sweeping change like that. And it can be one person at a time. If you take just 7 seconds and reread your tweet and ask yourself one question, next time you're ready to send out a tweet and just bang out something on the keyboard and hit send, take 7 seconds and go, is this positive? Does this build anything? Am I building someone up, or am I intentionally just tearing them down? We can make a huge difference by just focusing on being positive, on sharing our diversity, on sharing our ideas, on being a community, not just a tech community, not just a developer community, not an open source or a DevOps community, but we all live on the same planet. We all are facing the same problems, the same fears, the same uncertainty. So next time that you're willing to tear someone down that you probably never met in person, think about your own life, think about your own trials and your own problems, and remember that the person on the other side of that message is probably feeling very, very similarly to what you are.
Yep. That is good advice, dude. 7 seconds. That's all it takes. Just saying.
I like it.
How can people get in touch with you, brother?
So I've spent the last few weeks making it very easy to get a hold of me. I'm at IT Guy Eric, and that's on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Mastodon, just to name a few. Or, shameless self-plug, you can get a hold of me at Sudo.show. That's the website for the podcast, and we're on Twitter at Sudo Show Podcast. Or you can send us an email at contact@sudo.show.
Awesome. There's no lack of communication anywhere. People should be able to find you easily.
There is no excuse for not reaching out to me.
All right, dude. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. It brings back such good memories of the same type of conversations down at Self. I really appreciate you joining me. I do want to thank you for all of the talks that you've given, all of the encouragement that you've given me and the community itself, and all of the conversations. That is, I think, the one thing that I value the most is when you can talk to somebody and be on the same level and just be friends with them. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I mean, like I don't get to tell you often enough that if it weren't for your work in the community and Destination Linux and what that has grown to become and your friendship over the last couple of years, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have the voice that I have to kind of share my own story for other people. So I appreciate it, and I'm very humbled that you invited me on the show.
It was an awesome discussion. All right, that's going to wrap it up. Thank you all for joining us this week as we spotlight the best thing about Linux, our community. Until next time, long live Linux.